Hello, everyone. I'm Joey Rosenberg, Chief Product Officer at Women Who Code, the world's largest and most active community dedicated to inspiring women to excel in technology careers. I am incredibly honored to be coming to you today with a special guest, Tara Hernandez. She not only is a Women Who Code board member, but actually started this podcast. And so sitting in the interview seat today, I have to share a little secret. I'm a tiny bit nervous, big shoes to fill, but I'm completely honored to be having this conversation. Let me tell you a little bit about Tara. She has spent nearly 30 years evolving ways for companies to develop and ship software. She helped launch Mozilla and has been a firm proponent of open source ever since. She's also thinks that smart companies understand the business value of having a diverse employee base. Tara works at Google currently and is a member of the board of Women Who Code and a contributor to the Continuous Delivery Foundation. Please help me welcome our distinguished guest, Tara Hernandez. Welcome, Tara.
Hello. I will say you might be feeling nervous, but I am the same. It's weird to be on the other side of the interview for a podcast.
Definitely. So you've had an incredible career. You've spent nearly 30 years in the tech industry. And at the same time, you've experienced not only your own career evolution, but the evolution of the industry itself. I would love to ask you just to share a little bit of that career journey, what you've seen, what you've learned, and just any insights that you want to share with our community.
Sure. Yeah, it's been a trip. And I always like to start the story with the fact that I was not meant to be in high-tech industry. I had every intention of being a professor of history, life of the mind. I was going to double major in literature and history at school. And my parents said, no, you need to do a STEM major or we're not going to pay, because they wanted me to get a job. And I guess, the humanities were not a good idea. So here I am. And I became a computer science major because I had met some people who had email accounts. And back in 1989, that was actually unusual. And UC Santa Cruz, go Banana Sluts, would give any student an email address. You didn't have to belong to a particular major, get funding. And so that's how I got into computer science. And I'm a terrible student. I barely graduated. I struggled. It's not my forte. Another interesting point is I specialized in graphics animation because that was the only thing that I found interesting. Who doesn't like graphics animation, right? So very early days. And we had a lab full of old SGI hardware, which was the company that invented modern computer graphics. The first Jurassic Park movie was made due to that technology. So that was around the time I was in school. It was very exciting. But then I never used that degree, not once, ever, professionally, or at all, actually. I left school and immediately got a job at a company that built developer tools. And I was a build engineer. My job was to make the floppy disks that were going to go into the box and to make sure that the compiles ran. And this was a company called Borland in Scotts Valley. And it was the old school style of high tech. This was pre-internet days, and it would take many years in some cases to get product from start to finish. And you had to go to manufacturing and you had to actually produce the books, the manuals. There was no electronic books. So I have boxes here that are, the first ship award boxes, and they weigh 30 pounds because they're full of actual physical stuff. But when I left Borland and I went to Netscape, that I was recruited there by someone I had worked with at Borland, a woman named Joy Lenz, who was an amazing woman. I still count her as a hero and a mentor. And I went from this very staid, sort of old school, traditional software development, very analogous to manufacturing, to insanity, to chaos, a paradigm shift of thinking about what does it mean to do high tech. We're trying to release the first commercial web browser. And for a while, we were wildly successful. And then the rest of the industry, in particular, Microsoft, noticed. And thus began the browser wars, which resulted ultimately in the creation of Mozilla.org as we released our source code as a way to try and bring more community allyship, if you will, technical allyship, to try and beat Microsoft and Internet Explorer back. The outcome of that story was that it was not successful. Netscape eventually faded away as a viable company. And Internet Explorer was the lead browser for decades afterwards, but Mozilla lived on. And the beauty of that was, I think, the more important battle that we weren't officially fighting was one, which was that was the creation and the beginning of the modern open source movement. And because of that, not only do we still have Mozilla kicking around, fighting the good fight and trying to keep the internet a wonderful place to be, and keep our digital freedoms in place through advocacy and lobbying and all the things that Mozilla does. Big shout out to Mitchell Baker, who's an amazing woman who's led that organization for forever with grace and courage. But it also spawned a whole bunch of other things. For example, at the time, one of the challenges of developing software was that operating systems were tightly coupled to companies producing hardware. Because the hardware was the actual business. We call it Silicon Valley, not because of software, because it was a chip company, locale, right? So companies would produce hardware and you needed some software to run on it. You needed an operating system to run the software on. So all of the big companies had hardware, Hewlett Packard, IBM, DEC, everybody. And they all have their own operating system. So if you're trying to develop software that anybody can use, you have to develop software on all of those platforms. The success of Mozilla and how it did licensing, which is a very staid legal discussion, but critically important, showed that you could do licensing that was more open, that was freer, but didn't require you to give your product away. And that was the main sort of mental leap that as an industry that we made. The difference between a free software, for example, versus open source. And that made it more, that idea made it more compelling to companies. And companies started to realize, hey, we don't have to develop our own hardware and our own operating systems to develop software. Let's just all collectively start to agree that we're going to focus on particular operating systems, and in particular operating systems that aren't tied to a particular vendor, and thus open the opportunity for Linux. And so Linux swiftly became a very key player from like this Linus Torvalds side project, because he didn't want to pay for a Unix license to run his software. So he made his own version, and now everybody was using this version, and companies actually thought, this is a great idea. I don't want to have to support 15 different versions of my software. We'll just make it run on Linux. And so companies actually invested and created an open source foundation in order to pay, a sort of crowdsource pay for Linus Torvalds and some of his contributors, and thus was laid the foundation for the Linux Foundation, which eventually evolved, which has become probably one of the most, if not the most, critically important open source organizations on the planet. And out of the Linux Foundation has come all of these other initiatives, and the one that is the most interesting probably these days is the CNCF, or the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which is where all things open source and cloud tend to revolve. And another example of a technology that the industry as a whole decided, hey, we don't want a particular technology, this particular technology, to be proprietary. We want to have an industry standard so we don't have to worry about it. So when Google released Kubernetes, that was the beginnings of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, and Kubernetes is now sort of an industry standard around container orchestration. So I think, that's a long rambling description of getting to where we are now, which is high-tech industry not just being this commercial enterprise, though it absolutely is, but this crazy balance of the commercial and the community, keeping each other in checks and balances, trying to take the industry forward in the safest possible ways, because as we've seen with lawsuits around monopolies and other types of things, letting particular companies get too powerful is not in the best interest of the industry, and is not in the best interest of the users of the products of this industry. So without the development of the open source communities and the influence that they wield, I think we would be in a much scarier place right now.
Wow, I love that idea of community-driven accountability. That's so powerful, especially given that tech shapes our whole world today.
There was a great example in the last week where Microsoft contributed a programming language to open source. It's called .NET. So Microsoft originated it, much like Google originated Kubernetes, but they released it as open source. And someone at Microsoft made I don't think the malicious decision, but an unfortunate decision that was really in the service of Microsoft and not in the service of the community, and the community forced it back, right? They're like, hey, now that's not how the rules are played, right? And it was a very small example. And, you know, in the wider world, nobody cares, right? This is a subtle little thing for people who care about this particular programming language. But it was Microsoft, this enormous global company. And so that idea of community pressure to kind of hold things up, like, hey, now, when you contributed this, you change the rules. You get the benefit, but you also carry the burden of responsibility of playing by the right rules. And that is such a fundamentally powerful thing. I really fear where we would be without it.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing all of those insights about kind of how the industry has evolved. Your role was so, or has been so significant that you were featured in the
I don't know about that.
I think my biggest shocker of everything you went through in your story was that you started as with the goal of being a history major. I did not know that about you. That was really
history. If I could be a high-tech historian, that would be my dream job, honestly, kind of bring both worlds together.
You have the chops for that. I am listening to you fascinated about the historical knowledge that you have built through your own experience. I think that's really cool. So your personality, you, the human, were featured in Code Rush, the documentary that really followed how Mozilla was created. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience? I imagine it might have been kind of interesting to have yourself showed on the big screen, but tell us a little bit about that experience and what you learned, if there's anything you saw reflected back that seemed interesting to you.
Oh my goodness. Code Rush it's 20 years old, older even maybe. It keeps coming back up. Someone made the joke recently, it's become kind of like a cult film, except that it's a documentary. It was amazing. I remember, you know, we're getting ramped up. The Netscape marketing team led by Roseanne Sino. I know who came up with the idea, but she's the one who brought it to me. She's like, hey, you know, we're trying to do this crazy thing. We're open sourcing, or well, we didn't call it open source yet. We're going to release our software to try and get community contributors to help us out. There's this filmmaker, Dave Winton, who's interested in telling this story, and it would be great for us. And so they were looking for people who would be willing to be followed around for an indefinite amount of time and be part of the story. So I was one of the ones chosen, and I think I was chosen honestly initially for a little bit of color. I was a much more impetuous youth, to be frank, and I ruled my domain at Netscape with an iron fist, which was don't break the build. And you know, I was a little bit more hot-tempered back then, so there was a certain amount of fear involved, I think. Don't Stara off. But I also, you know, I would accept bribes. If you broke the build, you know, you'd bring us a bottle of booze because we would had to have tried to fix it for you or track you down or whatever it was that we had to do. So I had the booze collection in the build pit, which is where my team sat. And so we would do shots at the end of the day, which for us usually meant like 9 or 10 o'clock at night because we never left. And so now here comes this film crew, and it's a small crew. It was, you know, Dave was the director and the scripter, and then he had a camera guy and a sound guy. Sometimes there would be another person who would come wandering in, and they would just kind of be there. And mostly they were in the background. Sometimes they'd ask you to do something, or they'd ask you to redo something, like, hey, what you just did, can you redo that? Because they wanted to get a different angle. And it was a little bit weird, but mostly they were just quietly recording. I don't even know how many hours. I mean, they followed us around for months, but one at a time. So I think if it had been one crew per person, it would have exceeded the capacity of storage at the time. But they would pile. I had an Audi convertible, which was like my splurge after Netscape went IPO. I bought a used Audi convertible. That's what I could afford. And they all jammed themselves into the car. We put the top down so that the equipment would fit. And the other thing was I would take my dogs to work. And so it was me and my dogs and the crew driving to go to the sandwich shop to pick up a pile of sandwiches so we could have lunch. And they're interviewing me while we're driving, and they got like a little tiny clip of it. But every time I see that, I think there was like 9 beings jammed into that car driving down Middlefield Road in Mountain View. It was pretty funny. They came to my house. They were just kind of everywhere, and we became, at least for that time, like kind of very friendly, and I think they did that intentionally because it made it, especially for me, it made it so much easier to just talk to them. And I think for Jamie and Michael and Jim and Scott, they spent so much time with us that we started to get a lot more real and show a lot more of kind of the challenges of that experience. And now 20 something years later, looking back, I see it, and the first thing I think is, God, I was so young. But then I think, wow, I've changed so much. There's Jim and I argue about this a little bit. We recently were chatting because of a Code Rush event. They asked us to be on a panel, and I look back at that and I'm like, I would never, ever in a million years, as someone who has been in management since then, like what Netscape allowed to happen, 120-hour weeks, people spending days in the office for what, in retrospect, was a failed attempt to save the company against an arbitrary deadline. It's like, they announced that they were going to release the open source in Q1 of 1998, and by God, it was going to be released in Q1, which meant March 31st, 1998, which the project name was Source 331, and we had to hit it. And it was so arbitrary, and it was so ruinous to so many people. I was sick for most of the filming. There's one point where I'm calling in from home, but I'm still working. I sound terrible because I have pneumonia. And Jim was like, no, it was so great that we weren't compelled to do that. We were encouraged to do that. But culture, and that's, I think, the thing that I focus on now. The culture encouraged it, and peer pressure is enormous, and it can be both beneficial and negative. And in that case, was it worth it in the end? It's hard to say. If we had released a month later, would it have made a difference? I don't think so, but it's interesting to see how different I was, and that it keeps coming back. So I'm reminded of that, and less gray hair and all the other stuff.
That's amazing. I am so curious, and I'm sure your fans want to know, what alcohol of choice paid the toll? What satisfied the toll if you broke the code?
Well, some folks might know that my Twitter handle is Tequilarista. There was a QA engineer at Netscape, a beautiful, wonderful man named Paul Davis, and I'm not sure if he's with us anymore. But he started calling me the Tequilarista because that was I was like, bring me the booze, and we got whiskey, we got scotch, we got rum, and one day somebody brought, not Cuervo, because Cuervo is not tequila, it's disgusting, but a bottle of good stuff, which back then there wasn't a lot of good stuff out there. It was mostly Cuervo. And once I tasted that, it was all over. There was no other bottle for me.
That's amazing. And more seriously, culture. So you've talked a lot in the past about how kind of the money chase has changed culture of tech companies, and
oh my goodness, yes,
the responsibility for what that means and how we engage in it. And some of the things in the story are kind of hinting at that, right? Like these arbitrary deadlines and these really demanding cultures. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So, like I said, my first company was very staid. It was old school, very, years long product development life cycles. And when companies went public, it was a big deal, but it wasn't the biggest deal, right? But IPOs, and Netscape was the first of the big flashy ones. I think it opened at, I don't know, I'm gonna get this wrong, but I opened at like $26 a share, and by the end of the day, it had peaked at 72, which was an insane scramble. And that's where the Code Rush, aka Gold Rush, came from. It was that, like, oh wow, that amount of wealth just created, not because there was actual wealth to be had. There was no warehouse full of merchandise that had material value. This was people purely being excited about an idea. There was a subsequent documentary that I also got pulled into, I think because I was in Code Rush. They asked me. It's called Valley of the Boom, and it was on Nat Geo a couple of years ago. And it really touched on these things quite a bit, both with Netscape, a company called The Globe, which was a precursor to social media like Facebook or Twitter, and then a pure scam called Pixelon. Steve Zahn played the head of that company in the docudrama, and it was quite hysterical. But it was that realization of you can sell an idea, which was actually a re-realization, because a lot of people have sort of compared it to the P.T. Barnum quote, there's a sucker born every minute, or there's a sucker born every minute and two to skin them. People were throwing their life savings into these tech IPOs because they thought it meant instant wealth, right? What ended up happening is most people ended up losing their shirts, if not their houses. So that attracted, this is my theory, it has zero basis in data. So I just want to put that caveat out there. There's been a lot of discussions in various corners about this, but my view is that idea of being able to make money on something that had no material content, make money on an idea, attract a lot of people who might otherwise have gone into other industries. And so instead of high-tech industry being filled with nerds and a few astute business people, now it was everybody. It was the people who might have gone into law or might have gone into finance. I mean, there's been crazy shenanigans on Wall Street since before any of us have been alive, right? And now that energy and that mindset is coming to high-tech industry, and it happened. You saw it. By 2001, there had been so many what we call the dot-com startups. Pets.com is probably the most egregious example of that. There are many others where some very smart, ambitious person comes in, pitches some investors, they throw a ton of money. Those guys make a ton of money, walk away, everybody else loses their job, has to go on to the next startup, right? And it just repeated over and over again. And so in the bubble burst, the first one in 2001, and think about it, 2001 is only 3 years after 1998. So in the 3 years between the internet really ramping up, the beginnings of the open source movement, and this idea that sell ideas, make money, it flashed and fell. I was at a startup called Blue Martini at that point. I had left Netscape. I was burned out. I was done. I couldn't do it anymore. And a bunch of Netscapers had gone to found a startup. And when we went IPO, I was worth $7 million on paper with the equity that I was number 15 at that company. I had bought my pre-IPO employee stock options, which I think were something like 5 cents a share, right? So we went public. I don't remember what the IPO price was, but we all looked, right? Everybody looks, all right, I have this many shares. That was $7 million, give or change. But we had a black employee lockout. Couldn't, as an employee, unless you were an executive or some sort of special person, you couldn't actually exercise your shares. So we had to sit on them for 6 months. Right? They don't want the employees to sell and bail. Makes sense. Month, let's call it 4 in 2001 is when the bubble went pop. And I lost a whole lot of zeros after that 7. I think I went from 7 million to 70,000 or something like that within 4 months. All on paper. But at least in my case, that 70,000 was still greater than the, I don't know, $1,500 that I had spent. So I, call it a win. But I like to say I was an internet millionaire on paper once. But then it started all over again, right? And it repeated, and there was another bubble pop, I think, in 2008, right? So in that regard, that's a part of the industry that I really wish we could get over. But at this point, I think that genie is not going back in the lantern.
Wow. So fast forward to today, internet is everywhere. It's in my pocket, it's on my wrist, it's hosting this very conversation that we are having. How does this sort of omnipresent state of the internet make it more critical for DEI from a practical perspective and an ethical perspective?
Sure. So many reasons. One, it's starting to become unavoidable that there are systems, social systems that are now reliant on the internet to exist. So purely from the matter of accessibility, if you have a social system that relies on a technology, then it is incredibly critical. It is ethically, socially, pick all of your leaves, necessary that everybody has access to it. So what does that mean? Investments in broadband, free Wi-Fi. In our capitalist society, we scoff at things like that. If you want it, you pay for it, right? But when we make society itself dependent on a technology, then we have to enable that technology. But then you have to balance that with privacy, right? There's lots of lawsuits about how am I being tracked. If the government gives everybody a cell phone, if you don't have it, what's the government doing with that data? And so this goes back to this idea of the checks and balances with technology being so critical, not just because of technology itself and not letting a company get too powerful, but also as an industry that itself has checks and balances. It needs to somehow create checks and balances with the government. And nobody's going to like that, right? It's not that the open source and business interests in high tech are always hand in hand and happy and singing kumbaya, quite the opposite. So that sort of tension of we're keeping eyes on each other has to also be a part of that conversation. But the trade-off, I think that's really potentially awesome, is that the more we have these social structures that are based on technology, the more that we use that as a driving force to get at least some form of that technology engagement to everyone, the more that creates opportunity. One of the stories I love to tell is when Africa started to get wired up, there's a huge continent with billions of people, right? That's a market. Capitalism says, go figure out how to engage that market. So cable started running and technology started appearing, and the most amazing thing happened. I think it's happening to a lesser degree in Latin America, but still there too, which is there was a whole cohort of new technologists who came up with adapted ways to integrate with that technology. There was a great statistic that came out a couple of years ago. I don't know if it's still true, but at the time in the continent of Africa, something like 68%, I'm totally messing up these numbers, but some huge majority of software developers did all their development on smartphones or some kind of mobile device because they didn't have a laptop. The supply chain for laptops just wasn't there yet. Now it might be now, but on the backs of that inauspicious, or I don't know if it's inauspicious, but slow start, now you have Nairobi as a tech hub. Right? And that 10 years ago, what are you talking about? No, there's no tech hub in Africa. No, there absolutely is. There's several. But I like to talk about Nairobi because I saw a documentary and there was all these beautiful people in colorful garb and having a tech party. I laughed so happily to see that. And that's the beauty of tech, is it does cross boundaries. It does enable things in expected ways, and it enables people to do things. It allows people to showcase how innovative human beings can be and give a little bit, and we can take it as far as we possibly can, just based on our imagination and our motivation. And that's, I think, my favorite thing about tech, which is why I want to protect it, because the second it no longer allows that, then it becomes oppression, right? And I hope to never see that day.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for listening to the Women Who Code podcast. To hear the rest of this interview, check back soon for part 2 with Tara Hernandez. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Women Who Code. And be sure to check out our YouTube channel with hundreds of hours of free educational videos. Just go to youtube.com/Women Who Code. Thanks again for listening. And remember to subscribe, rate, and comment.